When Frodo and Sam pass through Ithilien during the War of the Ring, they're journeying through a pleasant land, yet a land that is devoid of any permanent inhabitants. They see old ruins, hidden refuges, fallen statues, and they witness a deadly battle between Gondor's rangers and the Haradrim of the south. But it wasn't always this way. Many years before, Ithilien was Gondor's garden, one of its most important provinces, and a land filled with people and song. In this video, we talk about Ithilien, Gondor's fallen heartland. If you look at a map of Middle-earth, Ithilien is quite easy to identify. It's a long yet narrow strip of land that exists between the Ethel Duath to the east and the River Anduin to the west, the marshes of Nindalf and the plain of Dagorlad to the north, and the River Poros to the south. Officially, Ithilien is split into two parts, the smaller North Ithilien that can be found north of Osgiliath, and the larger, wider South Ithilien, that is, as you would expect, south of the city. Even in its darkest days, Ithilien was considered a beautiful land. Much of the region was covered in diverse forests, with Tolkien telling us that the region was home to dozens of different types of trees and flowers. But it wasn't all just forests. The land had a constantly changing elevation, allowing for the existence of waterfalls, caves and pools, such as the ones at Heneth-Annwn. There was also the hills of Emin Arnon that looked over the Anduin. There were large, open fields, such as the Field of Cormallen in North Ithilien, and the river, later known as the Morgulduin, ran down from the Ethel Duath to the Anduin near to the very centre point of the province. Ithilien's earliest history is unclear. We know Nandoran elves made their way down to the mouths of Anduin, and given Ithilien's beauty, it wouldn't be impossible that some of them ventured into the land. The first men to enter Ithilien are believed to be the Druidine, and following behind them were the ancestors of the House of Haleth, the second house of the Edain. During the First Age and much of the Second Age, it's believed that Ithilien was known as Arnon, just like the hills, Emin Arnon. The origin of this word isn't exactly known. It could be a mixing of Quenya and Sindarin, roughly translating to besides water. The other alternative is that it came from a pre-Númenórean language, which could make sense, as there were many places in Gondor that retained a pre-Númenórean name. Ithilien would have started receiving Númenórean settlers earliest around 1200 of the Second Age, but more likely after 1700. Naturally, Ithilien was in an unenviable position, being right next to Mordor, which was the centre of Sauron's power. Later in the Second Age, Sauron did start making attacks against the Númenórean colonies, but we're unsure how badly Ithilien was affected by this. The fact that Ithilien had a large Númenórean population at the end of the Second Age suggests that Ithilien was not the focus of these attacks, and perhaps it was instead lands further to the south. Following the downfall of Númenor, Elendil and his sons founded Gondor and Arnor. At this time, the lands of Gondor had a large population of faithful Númenóreans, as well as those who were of mixed pre-Númenórean descent. Later evidence would suggest that Ithilien's population was primarily of Númenórean descent, and that most of the mixing with middlemen took place on the western side of the Anduin, in places like Lebanon. Because of its loyal Númenórean population, and because of its desirability, Ithilien, alongside Anorion, on the other side of the Anduin, became the true heartland of Gondor. Together, the brothers Isildur and Anarion would found Osgiliath along the Anduin, with the eastern half of the city being located in Ithilien. But whereas the western half of the city was protected by the Anduin, the eastern half of the city and the rest of Ithilien were not. In fact, at this time, Ithilien was the only Gondorian land east of the Great River, meaning it was far more vulnerable to attack from the east than the rest of the kingdom. So Isildur founded the fortress city of Minas Ithil in the pass between Gondor and Mordor. It was during this time that Ithilien became known as Ithilien, which means Land of the Moon, ruled over by Isildur, the Servant of the Moon, from Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Moon. During this time and afterwards, a number of important roads were built through Ithilien. There was the Osgiliath Road, later the Morgul Road that ran from Osgiliath to Minas Ithil. Another road, later named the Southwood Road, would eventually run down from the Black Gate to the Osgiliath Road. Where these roads met would become known as the Crossroads, and the road that ran from there through South Ithilien would be called the Harad Road. Finally, there was an unnamed road, or possibly just another part of the Royal Road, that started on the eastern side of the Anduin across from Pelargir, and ran to the crossings of the Poros, where it met with the Harad Road. Presumably, you had to use a ferry to get there. It was only shortly afterwards where Ithilien would get its first taste of war, but certainly not its last. In 3429, Sauron launched a surprise attack on Gondor and managed to seize Minas Ithil, although Isildur did escape. Sauron's forces then poured into Ithilien and attacked Osgiliath, but fortune quickly turned against him. Anarion's forces managed to drive back Sauron's armies from the walls of Osgiliath, and then even drove them back into the mountains and out of Ithilien. In the following War of the Last Alliance, Sauron would be defeated, and Gondor would establish the Watch on Mordor to ensure that no such surprise attack on Ithilien could be launched again. But Ithilien was not just vulnerable from Mordor. In 490 of the Third Age, Easterlings attacked Gondor, which may have included assaults on northern Ithilien. 10 years later, the Easterlings were defeated by King Tarastar, who took the name Romandikil I. But 41 years later, the Easterlings were back again, and Romandikil fell in battle. He was succeeded by his son Turambar, who not only defeated the Easterlings, but also conquered lands all the way up to the Sea of Rhûn. Although these lands were never properly settled by Gondor, they did provide a buffer that could protect Ithilien from any threats to the north and east. Between the 8th century and the 11th century of the Third Age, the Ship Kings ruled in Gondor. They conquered vast new territories, mostly in the south, and places like Harondor and Umbar were absorbed into Gondor. With the River Poros no longer being Gondor's southern frontier, Ithilien was now well insulated on all sides. An attack from Mordor would have to break through the Watch on Mordor, an attack by Easterlings would have to get through Gondor's eastern territory and its Northman allies, and an attack from Harad would have to get through Harondor first. Ithilien was now truly safe and secure, nestled in Gondor's heartland. So naturally, the threat that began to upend this came from within. In 1437, King Eldacar was overthrown and Osgiliath was sacked during the Kinstrife Civil War. The sacking of Osgiliath by Castamir's forces was widely unpopular in Ithilien. After all, Eastern Osgiliath was in Ithilien. Castamir only made himself more unpopular during his 10-year reign by neglecting Gondor's inland provinces, such as Ithilien. Thus, when Eldacar returned in 1447, the province threw its weight behind the exiled king. Castamir was killed, and Eldacar was restored to the throne, but not without spilling plenty of Dunedain blood, and not without losing Umbar to Castamir's sons. The lands beyond the Poros became a battleground once again, but Ithilien was still safe for now. Unfortunately, the damage done by the Kinstrife paled in comparison to the Great Plague that swept through Gondor in 1636. Places like Osgiliath and Minas Ithil were disproportionately affected, and many of the people in those cities fled to either the mountain valleys of Anorion or the woodlands of Ithilien, and even after the plague had ended, few of these people returned. Osgiliath, already partially ruined in the Kinstrife, would now have entire sections of the city abandoned, and as a result, the capital was moved to Minas Anor. As for Minas Ithil, it would become far less relevant, which would have dire consequences in the future. It was, however, not all bad. During these years, a prominent figure emerged in Gondor named Hurin of Emin-Arnon, which, remember, is in Ithilien. Hurin was a relative of the royal line of kings, and he himself would end up founding an important house, the House of Hurin. Hurin would become the steward of Gondor, and under him the role would change dramatically, becoming far more important. On top of that, the kings began to choose future stewards from amongst the House of Hurin, and eventually the position would become hereditary, and it was that line that would rule Gondor after the end of the line of kings. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The Great Plague weakened Gondor greatly, which loosened the kingdom's grip on its outer territories. The Watch on Mordor was largely abandoned during this time, and Gondor's influence in the east was greatly reduced, helped little by the fact that the Northmen of Rhovanion had also been left extremely weakened. In the south, Gondor would continue to contest Harondor and Umbar, and even briefly captured Umbar during the reign of King Telummatar Umbardakil, but this would all fall apart with the appearance of the Wainriders in 1856. In this year, the Battle of the Plains was fought between Gondor and its Northmen allies and the Wainriders. The battle was a disaster. King Narmakil II was killed, Gondor abandoned its eastern territories, and the Northmen were subjugated by the Easterlings. This also affected Gondor's grip on the south. Umbar was lost, and Gondorian power projection retreated deep into Harondor, and even to the River Poros, the southern border of Ithilien. Ithilien was now truly vulnerable again, and the people there knew it, which resulted in the beginning of a steady depopulation as the people of Ithilien fled behind the relative safety of the Anduin. Gondor would defeat the Wainriders for a time in 1899, but not entirely, and by 1944 the Wainriders were back and stronger than ever, and to make matters worse for Gondor, the Wainriders had allied themselves with the Haradrim. Their plan was for a two-pronged assault against Gondor, with the Wainriders coming through North Ithilien, and the Haradrim coming through South Ithilien. The Wainriders were successful in their part of the plan, decisively defeating the northern army of Gondor at the disaster of the Morannon, killing both King Ondahur and his two sons. However, the southern army of Gondor, led by Eärnil, a cousin of the king, decisively defeated the Haradrim at the crossings of the Poros. Despite a fighting retreat by the remnants of Gondor's northern army, the Wainriders were able to enter Ithilien. Now, the Wainriders excelled on an open plain where their chariots and horsemen were most useful, but Ithilien was forested and had rather rough terrain. You would think the Wainriders would be more careful, but they were the complete opposite. They overestimated their destruction of Gondor's northern army, and they assumed the Haradrim had been successful in the south. In reality, the Haradrim had been crushed, and a significant part of the northern army had survived intact, and had now united with Eärnil's southern army. Thinking that Gondor was defeated, and that there was nothing left to do but ransack the spoils, the Wainriders set up camp somewhere in Ithilien and celebrated. They were sitting ducks for Eärnil, and he annihilated them in the Battle of the Camp. Because the Wainriders made a generational fumble, Ithilien emerged from the Wainrider Wars far better than it perhaps should have, but things really only went downhill from there. In 1980, the Nazgul would return to Mordor, and 20 years later, they attacked Minas Ithil. After 2 years, the city fell and it became known as Minas Morgul. This resulted in yet another large-scale depopulation of Ithilien. Not only was the land no longer safe from the north and south, but now it was no longer safe from the east, and an army could march from Minas Morgul to Osgiliath in less than 2 days. But no such army appeared, at least not for 400 years. This was a period known as the Watchful Peace, which lasted from 2063 to 2460. During this time, those people that remained in Ithilien would have nervously watched Minas Morgul, waiting for evil to erupt and pour over them like a tide. But it didn't. At least not until 2475, when an army of Black Uruks suddenly emerged from Mordor and overran much of Ithilien and Osgiliath. Gondor weathered the surprise attack, and under the future steward Boromir I, Osgiliath and Ithilien were reclaimed. That said, Osgiliath was finally ruined in the fighting, and was left completely abandoned. You would expect Ithilien to have been abandoned as well, but that was not the case. Although emptied of much of its people, there were stalwart Gondorians who refused to abandon their land, even though it was highly vulnerable to attacks from the east, north, and south by this point. This remained the case for another 4 centuries. Despite constant warfare, the people of Ithilien stubbornly clung on. But this dogged resistance started to deteriorate in the late 29th century. During these years, Gondor finally had to abandon Horondor to the Haradrim, meaning that Gondor's southern border was once again the River Poros. In 2885, the Haradrim attempted to press their advantage by invading Ithilien, but Gondor, with the aid of Rohan, managed to defeat them. Nevertheless, by 2901, all but a few of Ithilien's remaining residents had fled, thanks to constant attacks from Mordor. As a result, Steward Turin II elected for a change in strategy. Instead of attempting to properly hold Ithilien, he decided that Gondor should wage guerrilla warfare against the forces of Mordor in the region. This was the birth of the Rangers of Ithilien, many of whom originally lived in Ithilien or were descended from those who did. To support these companies, Turin built a number of secret refuges, including Henef-Anun, and he refortified Caer Andros to allow the Rangers to cross into the region if doing so through Osgiliath was not possible. And finally, we come to the end. In 2954, the last residents of Ithilien realized that their resistance was futile. Mount Doom erupted, and taking that as an omen, the final residents fled across the Anduin. We know that at least some of these people settled in Lossarnach. Pippin's friend, Beregond, was from there, and he was descended from those who fled from Ithilien. But apart from the Rangers of Ithilien, the land was now effectively deserted, although it's safe to say that Gondorians never stopped seeing Ithilien as part of their land and as their rightful territory. By the time of the War of the Ring, the Rangers of Ithilien had been successfully operating for over a century, hindering Sauron's troop movements in the area. They knew Ithilien better than anyone else, and had strict protocols in place to ensure that their refuges remained secret. Frodo and Sam witnessed their expertise in person. They are present when the Rangers, led by Faramir, destroy a convoy of Haradrim. After Faramir lets Frodo and Sam go, he tells them that Ithilien is unusually quiet at the moment, and therefore safe, because Sauron has withdrawn everything into Mordor in order to launch his final assault against Gondor. Before the attack commenced, Faramir withdrew his rangers back across to Anduin, and they reinforced the garrisons of Caer Andros and Osgiliath. This assault begins a few days later. The Morgul host marches through Ithilien, captures Osgiliath, and then assaults Minas Tirith. However, the Free People successfully resist, and Aragorn then launches a counterattack with the idea of distracting Sauron. The host of the West marches through North Ithilien, and almost runs into an ambush laid by orcs and Easterlings. Unfortunately for them, Aragorn is accompanied by Mablung, acting commander of the Rangers of Ithilien, and he spots the trap, because Sauron's forces have laid their ambush in the exact same place the Rangers had ambushed the Haradrim. Because of this, the ambushers then become the ambushed. A few days later, Sauron is defeated following the success of the quest to destroy the One Ring. Much of the host of the West returns to Ithilien and camps at the Field of Cormallen. The army would remain there for a few weeks, and it's here where Frodo and Sam recover from their epic journey to Mount Doom. Afterwards, Aragorn returns to Minas Tirith, where he is crowned as King Elessar. King Elessar immediately got to work restoring Ithilien. Firstly, he decreed that Faramir, in addition to being steward, would also be granted the title Prince of Ithilien. He was to live at Aranornan, interestingly enough, the same place where the House of Hurin first emerged. He would be granted a personal guard called the White Company, and their first task would be to clear Ithilien of any enemies, rehabilitate the land, and destroy Minas Morgul entirely, because it would be unfit for habitation for many years. Truly a bunch of simple, easy tasks. Some years later, Legolas came south with a company of woodland elves from Greenwood, and they would establish a small elven colony somewhere in Ithilien. They would create gardens in Aranornan, and Ithilien would once again become one of the fairest lands in the entirety of Middle-earth. Interestingly, our final glimpse of Middle-earth, chronologically wise, is actually in Ithilien. The quickly abandoned New Shadow is actually set in a place called Pen Arduin in Aranornan, where one can look across to Anduin and see Minas Tirith in the distance. Even then, it's described as a beautiful place. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I'm kind of surprised this video ended up as long as it did. Normally the map tour videos are rather short, but that's because they tend to cover places where there isn't a huge amount of information. Ithilien actually has too much information. Wow, how annoying. Cheers, farewell, and remember, Isildur naming Ithilien after himself is kind of cringe.